Therapists of Reddit, what's your biggest, I'm not supposed to judge, but oh my god moment? Let's dive in. Story 1. Early on in my career, while working at a community mental health center, I had a 17-year-old client that had an 18-month-old daughter and was 4.5 months pregnant when we began working together. After we built enough trust in our relationship, she disclosed that she had been repeatedly attacked by her father for the past 3 years. He had sole custody of her because her mom suffered from addiction and had her parental rights terminated. She reported to him to the local police, small town. However, they were friendly with her father and didn't believe her. They told her they would only follow through with a report if she would detail her assaults with her father present, stating that if she could not do that they would know she was lying. Her biggest fears were that her children were biologically her father's. She would not get a DNA test because she didn't want to look at them or love them differently. I made several reports to several authorities that declined to investigate or remove her from the home. In the end, my supervisor and I worked our booties off to get her connected with a very thorough and helpful assault agency in another state. My agency and the new agency split the cost to get her there, settled and safe. She was 18-year-old by this time. I still think about her 20 years later and hope she's okay. Story 2. I had a preteen client whose guardian kept requesting progress notes to see how they've been doing. It's against clinic policy for clients and parents/guardians to have access to the notes. They're allowed to have access to everything else though. The client was very defiant to everyone, but was a wonderful kid throughout their treatment with me. When I met both with the guardian and parent, who both insisted on knowing everything about the kid, everything started making sense. Once the parent requested to switch therapists only because I declined their request to the notes, I knew how unhealthy the family dynamics were. I felt bad for the kid because they were opening up more about the family dynamics and how they impacted them. We had a good therapeutic relationship. Story 3. I worked with a teenager who was struggling with eating disorders, to the point she'd been hospitalized for organ damage at one point a few months before. I went to dinner with the girl and her mother. Her mom spent the entire dinner counting the individual pieces of rice she, the mom, was eating so she could accurately count the calories she consumed. I asked the mom to stop, and she just stared at me and asked why she would do that, because she had to watch her figure. I wonder where the 15-year-old got her eating disorder from. For those of you wondering why I was eating with the kid and the mom, the teen was inpatient and the mom was visiting. I was working as a psych tech, and the kid wasn't allowed to eat unobserved since I had to document her food intake to make sure she was eating sufficiently as a part of her treatment plan, so I joined her and her mom in the cafeteria for the meal. I definitely passed along the info about the mom's eating habits for the therapist to follow up with in family therapy. Story 4. A lovely teen girl was brought to her first appointment with me by her dad. Her mom had, as diplomatically as he could spell it out to me, recently up and left the family to go live some selfish new age lifestyle with a Reiki healer. Just abandoned him with 2 kids to raise solo, and he was doing his best for them. Therapy was the daughter's idea. She had been having troubling, intrusive thoughts lately about school shootings, like how to plan and execute one, and these thoughts were upsetting to her, and she did not want to act on them. I can still picture how scared and sad she looked telling me this. I just wanted to wrap her in my arms, but instead I offered so much praise and encouragement for her seeking help and trusting me with this information. She also met most of the diagnostic criteria for onset of a schizoaffective disorder. We pulled Dad into session, caught him up, explained the most urgent part of the plan. He was going to take her for a full eval with a great psychiatrist colleague of mine who understood the situation and was going to get her in stat. Daughter seemed relieved. Dad seemed relieved. We scheduled time to talk soon. Well, Mom woke up from whatever festival ditch she had passed out in to angrily call my office and flip out on me. How dare I? Am I trying to poison her child with pharmaceuticals? Did I even draw her blood and check her vitamin levels? Do I want a bad Google review, or worse yet, a warrant issued for my arrest? Do I even understand herbal supplements? I need to stop now because my head hurts remembering all of this. Story 5. Started my first year practicum at the county behavioral health working with foster kids. Shadowed my coworker for a session with a 10-year-old. On the drive back to the office, she told me that the 10-year-old was a victim of repeat CSA and has formed a great bond with her caregivers and wants to stay with them. However, her CPS social worker was actively trying to get her back with her mom, who was still living with her boyfriend that assaulted the client. Her therapist continued to advocate for the client to stay with the caregivers, because that's what the client wanted as well. I just cannot believe that CSA isn't an immediate nope, not getting your kids back if that person is still in contact/lives with the perpetrator. Or is the perpetrator. Story 6. When I was an intern in my MSW program, I had a 19-year-old client tell me she was pregnant. Didn't know who the dad was, but had narrowed it down to 3 guys. Was not going to stop smoking meth, and had no intention of attending her OBGYN appointments. However, she was going to keep the baby to let her mom raise it, like she did with her other children. Story 7. Used to work in an acute child psych ward. Saw a lot of angry preteen/elementary, think 8 to 12-year-old, mostly boys, and most often than not, parents treated the kid really harshly and were shocked this only made the kid worse. Also worked in an area where they did not want to hear their old school parenting could be a problem. Had one dad who said, "Well, yeah, I will spank him, 11-year-old son. When he gets angry, look, I know everyone nowadays doesn't like that, but I was spanked my whole life and I turned out fine." It took my entire ability to bite my tongue and not to say, "Sir, you just got out of prison 3 months ago after serving 5 years for a violent felony." Story 8. Not a therapist, but was a social worker. I worked with adults with developmental disabilities. ID now, a mother of one of my clients asked, "Why do I bother involving her son in activities?" Her son was dropped on the state's doorstep at the age of 3. Her son was 43 when he was my client. He delighted in and responded quite well to joining activities. It was another soul-crushing moment in the field. So many days of driving home crying and borderline alcoholism, to numb the pain, ended my almost 8 years in that field of work. Story 9. I had a client admit that they knowingly infected someone with HIV because they themselves were miserable and dealing with active addiction at the time, and they wanted someone else to be as unhappy as they were. This is and always has been a hotly debated topic in the healthcare world, for what it's worth. To clear some things up, no, I cannot call the cops just because my client does something illegal, and this is not an action that was always considered illegal or is considered illegal everywhere, by the way. It has to be something that is actively causing harm, or my client has to have active intent or a plan to cause harm. Whether or not you believe knowingly infecting someone falls within those standards is up to your personal beliefs and the laws and code of ethics of your particular state. And no, I cannot just ignore my career's code of ethics in the name of doing what I feel is right just because I find a client's actions abhorrent, or based on my personal interpretation of the code. Story 10. I'm not a therapist, but I worked as an RA, essentially a psych tech, at a mental health treatment center for about a year before moving on to a different area of healthcare. We had an addiction program, and many of the clients' past actions/behaviors were pretty hard to stomach. One man cheated on their wife with his ostensible best friend's teenage daughter while he himself had teenage children. Another frequently brought escorts into his home while his children were home. One man had norte action with animals. It's not so much that I judge them per se, but many of these stories engender sort of an existential dread. As in, wow, the darkness of the human condition runs deep. This could have happened to me or someone I know. It could be difficult to cope with. Many of clients were also extremely unpleasant to be around in terms of their personality. Domineering sorts, obsessiveness, terrible boundaries, no emotion, inappropriate emotion, manipulation, anger, irritability, compulsiveness, you name it. Takes a lot of understanding and compassion to support them through it all. Not always easy, but many of them had extremely traumatic pasts that made empathy easier to find. Commonly, they had experienced horrific sexual abuse themselves. In one case, a client was repeatedly attacked by his brother throughout childhood, while his parents knew all about it and did nothing. His mother even walked in the room during an assault and simply turned around and left. These are the types of things the clients dealt with. I think people who make a career in mental health are heroes, but I could not do it long term. It's a tragic reflection of our society that most people working in it do it for pennies. Story 11. I was a therapist pretty briefly and moved on to another profession, but I'll never forget one client in particular during my internship. My internship was at a site that primarily did court-mandated therapy sessions for people who were going through the criminal justice system. This client was in the system because he had molested his girlfriend's 12-year-old daughter while the mother was in the bed as they slept one night. As a therapist, they drive it into you pretty hard during your training that we're all basically good as human beings, and I believe that with very few exceptions, but this man was an exception. He felt no remorse or guilt for what he had done, and what's worse is tried to justify his actions. It was clear in speaking with him that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, not just with this child, but with others. Sitting with him for an hour at a time was difficult, and he stopped coming after only a few sessions. The email I sent to his parole officer stating that he had missed his court-mandated sessions was the only one I sent gladly in my time there. I'm sure this man had a terrible childhood himself, and perhaps over several years could get to a better place, but in my view, the only place for him was in a jail cell for the time being. Story 12. There's enough horror in here already, so here's more of a what situation. Was sitting in on psychoed eval interview during the later years of my training. Client was a high school age male who was known to the practice already. Before getting rolling, client asks for a tissue. Sure, normal stuff between spring allergies and all the standard reasons you'd need tissues in the course of therapy, we were plenty stocked. Trying to build some rapport as the outsider in the room, I did the how's the weather equivalent here. Oh, bad allergies? Nah, just need a parachute. Kiddo lays out the tissue on a side table, takes out his XR version of his prescribed ADHD medication, and proceeds to pop open the capsule, empty the medication onto the center of the tissue, wrap it up like a tiny old-timey bindle bag, and swallows it. My highly seasoned supervisor doesn't bat an eyelash, but I'm clearly perplexed, so the client explains to me that when he doesn't want to deal with the extended release as part of his meds, he simply removes the extension mechanism, the capsule shell, and swallows the med in a tissue parachute, which apparently was pretty standard practice among his peers. Had never heard of it before, have never seen it referenced since, but it stood out over the copious bizarre stories about illicit drag use I heard working with juvenile court for assessments because it was so normal-seeming. Story 13. I work in mental health and have worked in acute and crisis settings for the majority of my career. The most notable event I experienced was when a young person had presented with significant ongoing suicidal ideation who was dealing with a lot of stuff. I spent a lot of time with them, mostly de-escalation, and working out what the plan should be moving forward. One of their parents came in a little while later, and I had the opportunity to speak to them about where their child was and what had been going on, with their consent of course. Midway through me trying to explain some of the psychological constructs and ways the parent could help, they said to me, "Is this going to take much longer? I have a show to go and watch." All I can say is, I never judge my patients. I have never walked their path or viewed the world through their eyes. But the people around them who perpetuate the suffering of the people I work with through ignorance, malice, and selfishness, I judge them. Story 14. My mom was a psychologist. She passed away, and those two stories are decades old. 1. After 2 years of sessions, one lady still felt she wasn't able to overcome her dog's ears failed surgery. Your dog need to have certain specific traits to be able to do dog shows. Hers had flappy ears when pointy ones were required. There was obviously an underlying personality problem, but even though the lady really wanted to pursue therapy further, she refused to work/talk or address anything else. 2. Parents of a troubled child, which turn out to be the problem themselves. Total refusal to do any kind of introspection. Try to convince everybody, CPS, police, psychologist, doctor. The kid was the problem, complained the kid was a kid, a teenager at that point, by growing too fast and costing money to feed and clothe. He had smashed their TV with an axe. Turns out they hadn't speak or pay any attention to him in several years, and they spent 99% of their free time watching TV. Kid had no other behavior problem. Great in school, very calm. He just reached a point where he couldn't stand being ignored any longer, so he had what she called a fried green tomatoes moment. Parents dismissed their responsibility. Only problem they saw was the whack TV. Kid got emancipated at 16 and moved out of there. She had a private practice, and the only time she expressed any judgment was when someone sought therapy but refused to do any work or partake in the process. Paying a therapist is not paying someone to agree with you. You need to show up. You need to at least try. Story 15. Actual therapist here, licensed clinical psychologist. Much of my work with clients specifically focuses on how not to judge our performance as employees, our value as parents or partners, and our own self-worth. Honestly, my holy shit moments have more to do with how pervasive our tendency to judge is. No matter how accomplished or resilient someone is, she has the capacity to judge themselves harshly, and often do. The funny thing is, we often judge ourselves much more harshly than others. So I'm often amazed at how blind people can be to their achievements and strengths, and how unkind they can be to themselves. My role in those scenarios is to help them see themselves with compassion and to help them treat themselves as they would treat a loved one. It's a simple but not easy task, and I love every minute of it. I doubt this response is what the OP was looking to hear, but that's what comes to mind. Judgments are simple things, labels of something, a person, an idea, an object, as good or bad. They are ubiquitous in everyday life. They are painfully easy to make, and the problem lies in that we believe them. Judgment are just thoughts, and like all thoughts, they're not necessarily true. Helping people spot their judgments and either challenge or let go of them is a lifelong skill to develop. Story 16. I'm not a therapist, but similar scenario. I hung out with a friend back in June after not seeing her for about 8 months. She was arrested a few days prior for destroying her boyfriend's stuff. She was in an extremely toxic and abusive relationship on both ends. Anyways, I'm hanging out with her, and she's quite different. She's so paranoid and constantly taking pictures of people. She'd take a selfie and capture someone behind her, and tried to be sneaky, but it was obvious. Finally, I just asked her what is going on, and then after her hesitating, saying I wouldn't believe her, I assured her I would. Well, she starts by saying how her boyfriend is the leader to an underground secret society, like the Illuminati or some stuff. And he apparently is manufacturing some unknown drug that doesn't show up on any drug tests, and is using it to attack her and sell her body to random people. She said this is why she was taking pictures of everyone, because she's convinced they know her and know her boyfriend, and that they'll tell him they saw her with me. I was pretty freaked out, and I honestly believe she had to be suffering some psychotic break or possibly schizophrenia. The worst part of the story, and what really made me say holy damn, was her mum. So it turns out later that night she went to the ER because she was suicidal. I picked up her mum since she took the only car, and we drove to the hospital, but couldn't go in, of course, cause COVID. We were able to call and verify she was there, and spoke with the nurse who was going to do her psych eval. She couldn't tell us anything, but she did ask if we had any concerns or if she had a history of mental illness. Her mum said yes, just suicidal. She knows something else was going on with her daughter, and she refused to believe it. I was honest with the nurse and told her what I wrote above. Her mum absolutely flipped out on me, and get this, accused me of ruining their vacation. Apparently they had airplane tickets for Florida in 3 days, and they ended up committing her to psych hospital. I couldn't believe the mum cared more about her holiday and money than the health and well-being of her daughter. We haven't talked since this, but I hope she's doing better. I don't regret it. She can hate me all she want, but she was definitely in need of help. Story 16. I've spent my fair share of time in the ward, but I'm no therapist. There's an understanding that we're all a little messed up in there, so we really try not to judge each other, most of us anyways. But every once in a while you get those people who are just a different level of crazy. Now, I was on the ward for a suicide attempt, and it wasn't exactly a secret. You can usually pick out within the first few minutes who's there for finding the end of their rope, and who's there because it's better in jail. But then there are the ones who are there because there is no safer place for them to be, and you're usually lucky to see them because they spend most of their time isolated and doped. Well, I was lucky enough to meet one of them right before he got doped and isolated. He was such a nice guy that I assumed he was an attempter, like me. You tend to find a lot of the best qualities in people after they've tried to end their life. With this gentleman, that was very much the case. I saw the best in him. Can I take your plate for you? We have to tell him no. You're not supposed to be anything except self-sufficient on the ward. Can I do your laundry for you? Can I wash these dishes before we send them back to the cafeteria? A lot of this was going on, and after 3 days of it, it was definitely becoming apparent that his typical concoction of meds had fully worn off, and he was getting snippy about it. Well, my first experience with extreme bipolar disorder went a little like this. May I sit next to you? I'm a little tense, and would love a conversation to get my mind off of it. Sure thing, B. I'm gonna finish this pudding and put a show on. What would you like to watch? Oh, nothing. Hey, have you ever tried to hurt yourself? Yeah, I have. It's why I'm in here. Why didn't it work? Well, I stopped myself and drove here after I caught a glimpse of what it would do to my dad if he found me. I see. Well, they won't let me have anything in my room, but watch this. He hands me the end of a long strand of toilet paper. You hold that end and just watch. Now as I'm holding it, I already have this idea in my head that this guy is actively trying to hurt himself, so I'm a bit curious to see what he's doing, but I'm also a bit paranoid that he may have given up on hurting himself and is now targeting someone else. But as I sit there watching him twist this toilet paper and fold it in on itself, I recognize what he's created as the start of a noose, and it dawns on me. He's trying to teach me how to hang myself. I still think about that guy. I wonder what he's like day to day when he's regular. All I ever saw was this overly exuberant, bubbly personality, which was tailored to make people think he wasn't as crazy as he really was. He hurt a couple of nurses that night, and the day after his noose creation, he was isolated to his room for the remainder of my stay. Story 17. Licensed psychologist here. As many have said, judgments really aren't part of the gig if you've had good training and spent time doing the internal work on yourself as part of the process. That being said, I don't think all therapists have done that, so don't be afraid to stop seeing one if you don't think it's a good fit. I often tell clients that I see my role as being a navigator while they are the captain. I know I've been hired on to help plot a course from where they are to their goals. While I know a lot about the waters and landscape, psychology, human behavior, habits, etc., I count on them to be the expert on the boat and crew, themselves, their lives, important relationships. I don't expect them to take every recommendation or tool because they may know things that I don't, and I respect that. My job is to just help adjust the course as needed to avoid obstacles or deal with them when they come up. It's not my job to tell them how to live, what to do, or to judge them when they make decisions, even if those decisions are different than something we talked about. It's their boat. I almost always add, though, if I end up suggesting 20 tools/courses and you take none, but then come in complaining about us sailing in circles, that becomes a different conversation. Still their choice, but I'll call out concerns when I see them, with as much respect as someone does when talking to the captain. Even that conversation is without judgment, though. It's just about naming a process that you see occurring and seeking to understand what's getting in the way. Story 18. Therapist here. Honestly, I have never had a moment where I've internally criticized someone for their past. Not even the current decisions they are making. Therapy doesn't work that way, and I can't do my job properly if I'm being full of myself and intentionally project. That said, I do sometimes have reactions to people's stories, and I suppose there is an argument for that's judging. However, I'd disagree. The way OP phrased their question, I'm inclined to think they meant straight up, geez, what's wrong with you kind of judgment. But I can't ignore my reactions to people. The whole check your emotions at the door shit just doesn't fly in therapy. If you ever meet a therapist that tells you they can be completely objective, run. That's just not how people work. For example, am I supposed to suppress my pity when a girl comes into my office and tells me she isn't sad when she tells me her mom died? What about when parents of a handicapped child are relieved when their kid dies? Am I judging them in the critical way? Hell no. Do I reactively feel pity/sad? Hell yes. What about when I feel frustrated because a guy I work with is so close to understanding that his partner's anxiety has little to do with him? Am I going to get pissed at the guy? No. But part of responsible and competent therapy is that I acknowledge that part of me that instinctively reacts to others' stories. If I just push it down, it will come up in other ways, and then it could damage the work I do. As a therapist, I need to be mindful of how I'm reacting to what I'm working with. If necessary, I can consult with colleagues, in an ethical, confidential, de-identifying way, of course. Then, once I process any feelings I may have, I can go back to do what I do. I love the process of change, and being honest with myself is definitely a challenge. But I would hate to find myself critical of someone who is doing the best with what they have. Story 19. Child therapist here. I had a mother report that her child was having bathroom accidents suddenly, and at home only. He's a 9-year-old boy with no history of bathroom accidents or trauma in the past. Training tells us this could be a variety of things such as abuse/neglect, anxiety, PTSD, etc. Until I spoke with his in-home behavioral specialist, a clinician that helps behavioral/mental health issues inside the home to help create healthy family routines to cope. She called me and told me the real story. The boy was becoming very angry and spiteful with his parents for making him go back to school after full COVID quarantine had been lifted. He went into their bathroom, took his mother's robe, took a giant dump on it, and hung it back up. He also peed inside her dresser drawer. I'm not going to lie, my jaw was dropped when I hung up the phone. I then laughed so hard I nearly fell out of my desk chair. Story 20. Therapist here. This happened early on in my career. I worked in a recovery center for families. We received a family where the mother had a diagnosis of BDP, dissociative disorder, CPTSD, with domestic charges and battery charges, and had previous addictions. She had a couple of kids. Part of the program is how to relearn how to interact with your children and to play on your strengths as a parent in doing so. So here I am working with this family fresh out of my master's, and in all honesty out of my league. One of the kids was basically what we would call the Chaneller in the family. They channeled all the anger, sadness, and rage from the mom onto everyone else. We tried talking to the mom about how to interact with the kids different other than screaming. Literally everything was communicated with a scream, and grabbing or restraining, but mom couldn't grasp. She was in trauma therapy, but still was having difficulty processing. Anyways, one day we were out on a walk, and literally out of nowhere the mom body slams that kid to the concrete floor. Me and the other worker were just like, what? And in this moment I judged. This kid was like 6 and just looked so scared and sad. Story 21. Psychologist here. I try really hard not to judge, and mostly do pretty well. Everyone had their own shit going on, and it's not my job to judge, only help. However, when I was starting out I had a patient with a ton of personality issues. He had a very rocky marriage with a lot of infidelity on both sides. We were discussing how this had affected him over the years when he dropped the bomb that he had a threesome with his wife and his brother as payment for a loan that his brother had provided him. I did my best to control my reaction, but I wasn't very successful. He ended up testing the therapeutic boundaries after that to the point that I had to terminate and refer. About a month later, I was working with another patient who was having self-esteem issues when he revealed that he and his wife had a threesome with his brother too. I think I did better at controlling my reaction, but WTF people. 2 patients in a month? I haven't had that come up since, but I now still wonder what the prevalence is of people having threesomes with family members and their spouses. I worked in a prison for a while after those incidents, and I don't think much would make me go what the F anymore. Story 22. While in my graduate program, in a first semester class, the professor prompted us to examine our personal values and share what clients, if any, we would be uncomfortable serving. One of my classmates said, "Gay people," because he was personally disgusted by them. Another shared that her religious beliefs would not allow her to serve a client who was considering having an abortion. The professor thanked them for their honesty, gently reminded them of their duties under the NASW Code of Ethics, but ultimately validated their right to not serve certain clients, stating that if they harbored implicit biases they may do more harm than good. Fast forward a year to my internship, and I am assigned weekly 1-1S with a client who had rejected all her other therapists at the agency. I was told that I was a perfect fit, but not told why. When I met with the client, it became evidently clear. She was a white supremacist and I am white. All the other therapists she had met with at the agency were either Latino or African American. After the session concluded, I set up a meeting with my on-site supervisor. I explained to her that I had been assigned to counsel a white supremacist, and that white supremacy was against my core values. As such, I explained, I could not continue working with her because I harbored such a fundamental disgust for her ideology. I expected that, like those who shared in my first-year class, I would be thanked for my honesty, and the client would be reassigned. This was not the case. The pushback I received was significant, and I was told that I would have to serve her, that it would be a learning and growth experience for me. I had no choice in the matter if I wanted to keep my internship and complete my required hours. It was an incredibly traumatic year. Story 23. I'm a therapist that specializes in children's trauma, so I have a ton of these type stories. This one is more funny than sad, so I'll share it instead of some others. A 15-year-old female client of mine went to live with her sister and brother-in-law after she and her mother could not get along. One evening they called in crisis, so I brought them in for a late appointment. The client and her mother arrived both sobbing. After some prompting, the client tells me she has been having an affair with her 32-year-old brother-in-law. Besides the obvious implications for the family, the age of consent where I lived was 16, so we were also looking at statutory rape. On top of this, the client wanted to call her sister from my office to tell her of the affair. As you might expect, the sister freaked out and after worked to calm the situation, so everyone could at least speak. The sister requested to speak to me alone. The sister informed me that if it were true, my client would know a specific detail about her husband's D. Now mind you, it's not my job to believe one side or another, but with statutory attacks on the line I needed more information to report to the police. I went into the other room and asked my client if there was a specific detail of her BIL's D that stood out. She immediately told me she didn't know if any outstanding features, then suddenly said, "It's got freckles." I returned to information the sister about the polka-dotted D. The sister was adamant her husband's D was not bespeckled. In fact, about 2 minutes later, my phone started blowing up with pictures of her husband's D. There was no warning, just unsolicited pictures. Turns out the husband was uncircumcised, which is unusual in the Deep South. At that point, I called the police, gave them the story, and sent the client home with her mother. As I expected, the police found there has been no affair, but my client was mad as the BIL was about done with having her live there, and she wanted to punish him. Story 24. One client of mine bites and eats his fingernails. Gross, but not unheard of. Then I learn he stores his fingernails in a box in his room to save them for a snack later. A little grosser, but he's about 9, so I'm hoping he will grow out of it. What finally made me want to vomit was learning that when anyone in his family clips their nails, fingers or toes, they give him the clippings to add to his box. So when he's eating nails from the box, they could belong to his mother, father, or siblings. Yes, I've addressed the parents about enabling this behavior, but it is still happening. I'm aware that it seems like pica or some sort of nutrition deficiency, and for all I know it could be. I'm a behavioral therapist and not qualified to professionally recommend medical treatments to the family. I do know his parents have taken him to several doctors for multiple different tests for disorders, so this could have been addressed, and they just choose not to disclose the information to me. Story 25. Worked one summer at a summer school for special needs children about 2 years ago when I was 14. I was just a teacher aide, so most of what I was doing was playing with the lower maintenance children and just running errands for the teachers. One morning, I was helping the kids put their stuff into their cubbies, and one of the kids was just standing in front of his, staring at me with his lunch bag in his hands. This was one of the more violent kids who would act up at the slightest of breezes. He was about 11 or 12 and had severe autism. I asked him if he needed help putting his stuff away, and he replied with only some mumbling. I asked him to speak clearly, and he said, "I'm going to hurt you." I was really confused and asked him to repeat what he said. He then screamed at the top of his lungs, "I'm going to hurt you," and swung his lunchbox straight for my head. Luckily, I kinda expected this kind of thing to happen, so I was ready to duck, and he missed. I was not allowed to even touch any of the students because I was not trained to restrain them, so until the teachers got him under control, all I could do was run around the classroom as he chased me, until the teachers got him under control. Once the teachers restrained him, he was under control within about 10 or 15 minutes. When the teacher asked him why he did what he did, he said that he was angry because his dad didn't bring him to Denny's that morning. I was assaulted because a kid didn't get to go to Denny's. Story 26. Have a master's in clinical psychology and currently working towards my doctorate. I laughed reading this question because I feel like I have at least one of those moments per day at my clinic rotations, regardless of type of setting. One that stood out the most was when I was working a camp for children with various psychological disorders, most with some sort of behavioral concerns. The girl I was paired with had a history of aggressive and violent tendencies. We went the whole day without any problems. That was until we were doing some group physical activity to wind down and focus before leaving for the day. She didn't like that this meant no longer playing with a certain toy, so she took off her shoe and threw at the little boy in front of her. He had autism and immediately started crying and screaming. While someone helped him, I turned to the girl to explain to her what she did was wrong. As I turned towards her, she punched me square in the face, then grabbed a hold of my hair. Managed to pull out a good chunk. I'm about 5'1", and this girl was maybe 1 or 2 inches shorter than me and had about 20 pounds on me, despite being 9 years old. Trying to get a safe physical restraint was difficult and comical to say the least. Finally got some help from other staff, and we were able to calm her down after about 15 minutes. The kicker was when we told her mom what happened, she basically dismissed the entire thing and laughed about it. So frustrating because you just know this kind of thing is reinforced at home as there is no punishment. The girl then starts hitting her mom, who grabs and holds down her arms. The little girl laughs, looks at me and the other staff member, and says, "Ugh, a little help over here? Are you going to let her do this to me? She's hurting my arm." I went home and did this weird laugh/cry for a few hours. Luckily, you learn pretty quickly not to take things personally and move on, so things were back to normal the next day. I do occasionally look back at that day just baffled at how quickly that whole situation escalated. Most of the other moments that come to mind involve poop in some capacity. Story 27. I had a client, an older female refugee that I worked with for several months before she told me that she had court the next week and was worried because she could be deported if found guilty. She didn't tell me earlier because she was ashamed and suffered in silence. She was living with extended family, and the family got busted for smuggling and selling khat, a stimulant narcotic. The family determined that she would take the fall for her husband and sons who were behind the operation. At the arrest, the police brought an interpreter for a different language, from a different ethnic group, in a different country than the client was from. On top of that, she said the police didn't have an interpreter present during the questioning at the station, and she waited there for almost 2 days until they found an interpreter for her language. I asked her if she understood what was happening, and she said her lawyer, public defendant she met once, told her she would be deported. Beyond that, she had no understanding of the situation, process, etc. I had seen her psych eval stating that she had the cognitive equivalent of a 7-year-old. So I told her that we have information that could help her case, and that her lawyer should see it as soon as possible. This was on a Friday, court was on Wednesday, and the client didn't know the name or any information about her public defender. We got a friend to help her collect the information. The client brought it to me on Monday, signed the ROI. Lawyer called me back that afternoon saying they've got nothing to help this poor woman, even though the case seems completely set up. I told the lawyer that we've got a whole bunch of insight and data and records that will get the charges dropped. I didn't work Tuesdays and was going nuts worrying and hoping everything would get to where it needs to and in the hands of the people who need to see it. On Wednesday, news from court comes that all charges were dropped. I used to get all kinds of sprung on me at the last minute, then have to perform all kinds of bureaucratic trapeze maneuvers to alter the outcome of high-stakes situations. I wrote so many letters. I was hired to be a mental health provider, but I ended up doing tons of case management because nobody else wanted to.